This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded in front of a live audience here at the 2016 Limud Conference in Birmingham, UK. My guest today is a literary historian teaching at Queen Mary, University of London, and today we're going to discuss a new and exciting project she just finished, a walking tour app exploring Jewish East London through the works of Israel Zangwill, a 19th century Jewish novelist. Dr. Nadia Valman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So, Israel Zangwill has been described as the Jewish Dickens. Can you unpack this for us?
Yes. The reason Zangwill is described as the Jewish Dickens is that he has a wonderful satirical style. And he had great material for his novels and for his satirical writing in the Jewish community of London at the time he was writing, which was the late Victorian period, in the 1890s and onwards. And the Jewish community at that time was a very divided community. There was an established, upper-class, wealthy Jewish community living in the West End of London. And there was a new immigrant community who'd come from Russia and Eastern Europe in recent years and were living in poverty in East London. And the relationship between these two halves of Anglo Jewry was one that was very fraught. And that was the source for a lot of Zangwill's comic fiction and of his satirical analysis. So that's why he was the Jewish Dickens.
What kind of analysis did he engage in? Was he progressive? Was he really, a socialist?
Well, I'll give you an example. Zangwill's novel *Children of the Ghetto*, which my app is based on, begins at the Jewish soup kitchen for the poor in the East End of London, and it's a very, it's in many ways a very tragic scene, but also at the same time a comic scene. And there you see dignitaries from the West End Jewish community speechifying, pontificating about the virtues, the charitable virtues that they're demonstrating in devoting their time and money and effort to feeding the poor in the East End. But meanwhile, those poor people themselves are clamouring at the door for food. They're starving, hungry, waiting for food. And Zangwill pulls no punches whatsoever in condemning this hypocrisy, this humbug, as Dickens would have called it, in the lack of humanity and compassion amongst those upper and middle classes towards the people who they see as the object of their charity, but who they don't essentially see as humans like themselves.
Mm-hmm. Was he critical also of the poor Jews?
He sees also great sources for comedy amongst the poor. So his novel looks at the wranglings, for example, amongst the ultra-Orthodox communities over very, very small matters of liturgy and law. He sees the struggles he sees the growth of Zionism in the East End. He sees the growth of anarchist politics and the political wranglings amongst factions of the radical left, amongst the immigrant community as well. And all of these are subject to the same kind of critical eye as the upper class Jews.
What can you tell us about his own personal biography, and to what extent it really informed his outlook on that?
Well, Zangwill, he's an interesting figure. He was born in 1864, and he was born in London. His parents were immigrants, but he himself was not an immigrant. So he had something of a distance from the immigrant community who had begun to move en masse to London in the early 1880s, from the early 1880s onwards. So Zangwill grew up going to school in the East End of London. He spent some of his time away from London, as his father was a peddler and travelled around the country. But he returned to London, to the East End, to the Jews' Free School, where he became a pupil and then later a pupil teacher, which was a Victorian practice where star pupils of the school could become teachers at the school. And it's there that he really witnessed the influx of Jewish refugees and economic migrants to the East End, and watched and observed their struggles, their hypocrisies, their daily life, their conflicts. And I think he was storing all of this up for later writing it out into a novel which became a very complex and developed ethnography of the immigrant community in the East End.
How was it received at the time? It was purely a Jewish literature, right? It probably was looked down upon both by the general population and also the two sections of the Jewish society that it criticized.
Well, it was actually received with enormous acclaim, and there were quotations from literary journals at the time saying this is the greatest Jewish novel ever written. He didn't have a great deal of competition, it has to be said, at that time. So.
That's hardly a compliment, is it?
But nonetheless, I think there was an enormous fascination with the immigrant community. They'd been subject to a great deal of government investigation. Lots of journalists were very interested in coming down to the East End to observe the Jews. But there had been very, very little writing from within the Jewish community about this insular world. And so I think, along with hostility, which was certainly on the rise at the time Zangwill was writing, there was also a great deal of fascination, and the novel really fed this fascination.
Do you think that it really affected the course of history for that community?
Well, in terms of the ways that they were perceived by the general public, you mean?
Perceived, and of course how it translated into policy later on.
Yes. Well, when Jews had originally immigrated when the big mass immigrations had happened in the early 1880s, there was really a lot of sympathy for Jews, and they were seen as victims of persecution, of pogroms, and there was a lot of campaigning on their behalf, and a lot of public feeling that wanted to support this movement and be sympathetic towards Jewish migrants. But 10 years or so on, things were changing, and that sympathy started to wane somewhat. And as often happens, initial sympathy turns gradually to hostility. And so in the East End, there was enormous competition for jobs, for housing. All of those things were under great pressure, and it was a time of employment instability. It was a time of increased pressure on housing. And the influx of immigrants, as we see today as well, was blamed as the cause of these problems. So feeling was turning against the Jews. There was some attempts to stoke up violent hostility against Jews on the streets of London by politicians in the East End, right-wing politicians in the West End. And we see that sort of thing in the rise in the 1890s when Zangwill was writing. And it can be said that those groups were trying quite hard to pressure the government to restrict immigration. And had they done so, this would have been the first illegalizing immigration or restricting immigration would be the first time that would have been done in the 19th century, because there had been open immigration to Britain all through the 19th century. So it would have been a very significant move. And Zangwill's novel is credited with changing public opinion, sort of shifting public opinion to regard the immigrants with a much greater deal of complexity and sympathy. It has to be said that law did eventually pass in the early 20th century, but I think in the time and in the 10 years following Zangwill's novel, it did have a significant effect on public opinion.
What role did Zionism play in all this? Then, in the very early stages thereof, Zangwill himself became a prominent Zionist leader in the UK. What can you tell us about the relationship between his idea as a Zionist and the rest of his work?
Well, Zangwill eventually became a territorialist, meaning he was one of those who were seeking to find a Jewish homeland for the Jews somewhere in the world that wasn't inhabited. That branch of Zionism ultimately failed. Zangwill was someone who was who committed himself to a number of political causes in the 20th century, following some time after he wrote Children of the Ghetto. So he was also a pacifist during the First World War and also a campaigner for women's suffrage. Zionism does not play a big role in Children of the Ghetto. He depicts some early a Zionist poet who is very much the object of one of the objects of his satire in the novel. But I nonetheless think that part of what he's doing in the novel is really grappling with the question of what links Jews together. What is the Jewish collectivity? What is it that binds Jews together, and what will do so in the future? So I think that those questions continue to preoccupy him and took a political form later in his life.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about the app. What were you trying to achieve, and how did you do it?
Well, in some ways, I was trying to experiment with literature. I was interested in what it might be like to experience hearing a novel in the places where it's set and where it was written about. So the app takes you on a walking tour of Spitalfields, where Children of the Ghetto is set. And we are very lucky because a number of the sites, very key sites in the novel, where important things happen and important kinds of discussions of social history are articulated, those are still there. So the app takes you on a trip around those different sites, 7 different sites around Spitalfields. And as you go, you can hear extracts from the novel. You can hear all kinds of other different oral sources, such as clips from interviews with oral history interviews with people who were living in Spitalfields around the time the novel was written, or a little bit later, from the Jewish Museum's archives. You can hear archive music. You can hear my commentary on the novel. And at the same time, you also have a number of visual sources to look at. So you can see archive photographs of those sites at the time the novel was written. You can see documents that relate to those sites at the time the novel was written. So, for example, we can go to the soup kitchen and see some of the records of the soup kitchen. We can see some of the illustrations of that soup kitchen that were there in the general press and in the Jewish press at the time.
Mm-hmm. How much of that history is still there, other than the buildings? Is it really all ancient history? Is it all gone now?
Well, I think that the East End, the Jewish East End, has become a great object of nostalgia now. And what's interesting to see in Israel Zangwill's work is that he in some ways was the beginning of the nostalgia for the Jewish East End that we now see flourishing. So my app is part of that in some ways, but it also seeks to present a much more complicated account of that past than the nostalgia really allows for. So I really want to bring back a sense of how complex and conflicted Jewish history the Jewish experience was at that time. And I think that using lots of different kinds of sources, bringing those together in conversation, the novel, but also other kinds of things, other kinds of texts that don't necessarily accord with the novel and that bring a sense of diversity to what was being said at the time and what can be said. I feel that hopefully that does counter an easy nostalgic take on the Jewish East End past.
It's not for Jews only, is it?
It's not for Jews only. In fact, I partly wanted to make this history much more accessible. And I think that a novel is a great way to make the past accessible because it's lively. It's a wonderful kind of exuberant and lively and witty prose. So it's a very it's a fun and interesting way into that past. And it also, I hope the app is one way to make sense of these sites that we have around the East End that won't make sense to many of the people who walk around the streets there. So, for example, there's an arch in one of the streets in the East End that is a remaining fragment from a model dwellings, a block of tenement buildings for Jewish workers that was built in the late 19th century there. And when that was demolished in the 1970s, all that was left was the entrance arch for it. But that's not marked in any way. There's no plaque telling you what that means and what that's for. So I hope that people can use the app and gain some sense of the meaning of those fragments of the past in the streets.
Okay, we have a bit of time for questions from the audience.
Would you recommend reading the book before you take the tour? And very quickly, did he write any other books?
The app is designed especially for people who don't have the time to read the book. And one of the reasons I think Zangwill's been out of favour in the 100 years or so since he's written is because his novel is a very big, baggy Victorian novel, and it's very much out of not to current taste, I think, but nonetheless it has some absolute gems in it. So I hope what the app has done is to extract those gems and make it live again. So absolutely no, you don't have to read it. Yes, he wrote other books. One of his most famous texts that perhaps people still have heard of is a play called The Melting Pot, which in fact coined the phrase that became the American term for multiculturalism in American culture. And that's today probably his most famous work. But he also wrote a series of extremely interesting short stories about also about the process of modernization and Anglicization that Jews were going through in the late 19th and early 20th century. Well worth reading, extremely accessible.
Any more questions?
Hi, thanks. Sounds like a great project. I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts about what it's like to experience a novel in a site, in a place, and what you've noticed so far from your tests and what you hope this project will bring in that respect.
One of the most interesting things about working with sound in a place is that I think it makes people observe what's around them much more sharply. So my sense has been that people are looking very, very carefully at what they see around them, those buildings and the signs of the past and the fragments of the past, because they are hearing things about that in their ears. So there's something quite interesting that seems to happen between the visual and the oral that an app can really make happen. So that's very much one of the things I hope will work with it. And I want to make Zangwill's work more accessible to a broader audience. I want also for Jews to remember their refugee roots. That's, we've been celebrating Refugee Day at Limud this week, and part of the objective of the app is to remind Jews of those complex times, and indeed to remind the broader public that the life of migrants and refugees is complex and interesting, and that's, it seems to me, what Zangwill's novel does, and what being in the East End today can also do.
Okay, we have time for one last question. There are any? Yes, please. Do you have plans for any further similar apps?
I'm not making any apps at the moment, but I will be engaging in a project with the Migration Museum project in London next year, which is a project to use, similarly as I have done with Zangwill, migrant literature from various places and various communities to explore areas of London that have been that we'll see through new eyes through migrant literature. So I am developing this idea and expanding it beyond Jewish literature.
Go on.
I should also say that the app is free to download. So if you
we didn't mention its name. It's called
yes,
Zangwill
it's called Zangwill Spitalfields, and it's available for Android and iOS. So if you Google that, you'll come to it. And if you're not in London or visiting London, then you can also see the material on a website which presents the same material, where you can just take a virtual tour of Spitalfields and Zangwill Spitalfields.
All right, Dr. Nadia Valman, literary historian teaching at Queen Mary, University of London. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer. and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shendlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.